Since the dawn of the Final Fantasy series, Square has always had a rather one-sided rivalry with publisher Enix. In fact, the mantra of the development team while creating the first Final Fantasy was, let's make an RPG that doesn't feel like Dragon Quest. And it ended up being a success, but not one that came even remotely close to rivaling that of Dragon Quest in Japan. The NES version of Final Fantasy actually sold better in America with 700,000 units than it did in Japan with 600,000. Though I have to assume the differences stemmed mostly from the time of release, with the NES install base in 1990 America being larger than that of 1987 Japan. That's not to say that Square was failing to carve out a fan base in the JRPG market. The sales of Final Fantasy would steadily improve with each release, reaching 1.5 million sales of Final Fantasy IV on the Super Famicom. Most companies would consider this a win, but not Square, who were determined to break out of the massive shadow cast by Enix. After all, it had taken them 4 releases to match the sales numbers of the first Dragon Quest game, which had also hit the 1.5 million mark, while its best-selling entry, Dragon Quest III, had sold almost 4 million copies. As a result, Square's mantra shifted for the development of Final Fantasy V from let's make something different than Dragon Quest to let's make something better than Dragon Quest. And this approach paid off for Square, for the most part. While it still didn't surpass the sales numbers of Dragon Quest III, Final Fantasy V was a triumphant success, selling its entire first print run of 900,000 copies in a single day, and it ultimately ended up selling almost 2.5 million units overall in Japan, making it far and away the best-selling game Square had made up to that point in their history. With such a successful title on their hands, of course Square would want to release it outside of Japan, right? Well, we already know the answer to that. Just like Final Fantasy II and III before it, Final Fantasy V was passed up for a worldwide release, although Square did seriously consider it several times. The most well-known attempt was to rebrand the game as Final Fantasy Extreme in reference to the game's complexity, but a lesser-known second attempt came a couple of years later in the form of a PC port, which actually got a decent way through development before being scrapped. The reason Square ultimately decided not to release the game in North America is often incorrectly simplified as Square thinking the game would be too difficult for Western audiences to understand, but the truth is more nuanced than that. Final Fantasy was easily the most successful console RPG series in America at the time, but it still didn't sell amazingly well. Even Final Fantasy IV, which was a critical hit in America, was far from a sales giant, and that was after the game was tailor-made to be easier for an American audience. You see, the common consensus from Japanese game devs at the time was that RPGs weren't catching on in America primarily because of their overall slower pace and unfamiliar mechanics when compared to the action-oriented games that were successful there. Both of these qualities would be exacerbated by Final Fantasy V's in-depth job system. Selling a game as, here's this foreign concept but even more complicated this time, didn't exactly seem like a strong marketing plan that would suddenly create a bunch of new fans. So, for the time being, Square had moved on, but fans in the know certainly hadn't. The popularity and feasibility of emulation had increased throughout the mid-90s, and one of the biggest joys of the technology was getting easier access to games that never left Japan. This, of course, included Final Fantasy V. Being able to easily obtain a ROM of the game was just the first hurdle, however. The language barrier was still a significant issue. In an attempt to make the game more palatable for English-speaking audiences, fans created full-on text walkthroughs, giving the player a secondary reference to know what each command did and what was happening in the story. While this was incredibly helpful for those with the patience to use the method, having to constantly leave the game to reference a guide wasn't exactly an ideal way to play. Some other dedicated fans from a group known as RPGE got together to work on an even more ambitious project, digging through the ROM's code and modifying it, using the previously mentioned text translations to make the English version of the game that Square denied them. And in October of 1997, less than 2 months after the North American launch of Final Fantasy VII, the first fan translation of Final Fantasy V hit the web. This timing was impeccable, as the massive hype surrounding Final Fantasy VII had far more eyes on the series as a whole. Many players wanted more Final Fantasy, and when looking into earlier entries, realized there was a large gap between Final Fantasy III on the Super Nintendo to Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation 1. While researching the missing titles, and of course sorting out the infamous Final Fantasy numbering fiasco, many players inevitably stumbled upon the fan translation of Final Fantasy V. While Square may have considered it financially unviable to translate and ship a lot of their games overseas, players could now at least be hopeful that in time fans would make the games playable instead. and in the 2 years that followed, fans did indeed take matters into their own hands, releasing fan translations for both Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy III for the NES, finally filling in the series' missing links. The new hunger for RPGs in the West didn't go unnoticed by Square, who were happy to capitalize on the series' newfound popularity. They began to port as many of the earlier entries in the series as possible to the PlayStation, giving the lesser performing games a second chance at success. This strategy was easy in Japan, where all they had to do was plop the ROMs on a disc with a custom emulator. However, that would not be the case for other territories. Square decided they would release both Final Fantasy V and VI in America in a bundle package called Final Fantasy Anthology. Luckily, Final Fantasy VI already had an English release, so porting that game was as simple as it was in Japan. The real hurdles came with Final Fantasy V. Because Square wanted to put out the game with as little time and financial investment as possible, they dug through their old archives and slapped the rushed Final Fantasy V translation that was originally going to be used for the previously canceled PC port onto the PS1 version of the game. Unfortunately, this slapdash effort makes for what is widely considered to be the worst English localization a Final Fantasy title has ever had. It is infamous for a whole litany of things, including many typos and Ferris's forced pirate accent, but perhaps the most comedic error was the misnaming of the classic Final Fantasy creature Tonberry to Dingleberry. Add to that the long load times due to poor emulation in the PlayStation's disc format, and, well, the best I can say is that it's technically better than nothing. Fortunately for fans, better than nothing wasn't their only option, and they largely stuck to playing the fan-translated ROM, at least until 2006. 14 years after the game's original launch, Square finally gave Western audiences a decent official release on the Game Boy Advance, fittingly titled Final Fantasy V Advance. And this brings us to our usual question. If you were to pick this game up either for the first time or for a hit of nostalgia, which version is best? Well, from this point forward in the series, the difference between the version releases will be much less drastic than in my previous videos. There aren't many examples of versions being as different from each other as, say, Final Fantasy Origins versus Anniversary, or Final Fantasy IV 2D versus 3D. With the exception of some bug fixes and a couple extras, the only significant differences between all the versions of Final Fantasy V's is in the presentation. And for this game in particular, I don't think one is significantly better than the other. The Super Nintendo version has darker colors and a higher resolution, which means it's going to look better on larger displays, but because of Final Fantasy V's more upbeat story, I actually think that the vibrancy of the Game Boy Advance palette works for this game. I also feel that a lot of the redrawn battle backgrounds of the Game Boy Advance version look superb, though they tend to be more static than their Super Nintendo counterparts. I much prefer the look of the Game Boy Advance's interface to that of the Super Nintendo original, but I don't really care for the style used for the game's character portraits. When it comes to the translations, the Super Nintendo fan translation is functional and not much else. It gets the job done, but has very little flavor or character, while the Game Boy Advance translation tries harder to hit on the clearly intended comedic tone of the game, with mixed results. As with every other Final Fantasy re-release for the Game Boy Advance, Square added an extra dungeon to the Final Fantasy V port, and this is one of the worst, most aggravatingly annoying dungeons I've ever had the displeasure of exploring in an RPG. It's not really difficult or challenging, it's just long and convoluted. I enjoyed the bonus content added to most of the previous Final Fantasy remakes, but Final Fantasy V really drops the ball. The Game Boy Advance version also adds 4 bonus job classes, but because you unlock them by completing what is essentially post-game content, there's nothing left to use them on. This means the addition to this particular version of the game are basically a wasted effort. The only obvious downside of the Game Boy Advance version is that the music quality takes a hit compared to the Super Nintendo original, which will be enough to turn some people off from this version completely. Normally, it would become a problem of picking your poison, a weaker translation or weaker audio quality, but thankfully the internet has provided us with solutions to this. There's a patch that ports the Game Boy Advance translation to the Super Nintendo version of the game, and there's also a sound restoration patch that makes the Game Boy Advance version's music sound much closer to the quality of the Super Nintendo's release. So no matter your preferred style, you can easily mix and match all of these elements to make a version of Final Fantasy V that suits your tastes. You may have noticed that I've yet to discuss the PC and smartphone port, and while this may surprise you, I don't hate it. It's definitely not my preferred way to play, but I feel like the backlash against it has kind of gone off the rails. While the character sprites turned me off at first, I got over them within a couple hours of playing. And while you never catch me saying that the characters actually look good, the enemy battle sprites and battle backgrounds did impress me from time to time. Honestly, the most annoying thing about this port to me is something I never see anyone else talk about. The conversion from smartphone touch controls to gamepad controls on the PC has the strange side effect that the game can only handle one input at a time. This makes actions like opening treasure chests feel clunky. I had to completely remove my thumb from the D-pad before pressing the action button for the chest to open. It's the most nitpicky of complaints, but it just felt weird as a player, and it bothered me much more than the arguably subpar graphics did. That That, along with the option for 8-way movement, which the game simply was not designed for, makes the port feel a bit unpolished. But hey, the story and gameplay from the Game Boy Advance release are fully intact. It also uses the Super Nintendo versions of the music, which arguably mixes and matches the best aspects of both official releases. Add to this the fact that it's the most readily available version, and you could do much worse things than spend your time with this port. For the first time since I've begun my Stiles series synopsis of Final Fantasy, I can say that any version of the game is worth playing. In a sick way, I'd even recommend the PS1 release because the script is awful enough to actually have made me laugh a few times. Obviously, I've got to point out that this is laughing at the game, not laughing with the game. But if you really forced me to choose a favorite version, I'd probably go with the Game Boy Advance edition for its translation and UI, with the previously mentioned sound restoration patch, of course. This is the part where I say the same thing every critic who's covered FF5 does. Final Fantasy V takes the mold created by Final Fantasy III and improves upon it in every conceivable way. Look, I never claimed to be creative. In my Final Fantasy III video, I pointed out that a lot of the job classes weren't worth using in the mid to late game because they were flat out replaced by upgraded versions. Black Mage to Magus or Monk to Black Belt. There were also several job classes that had near identical functions and performed them in near identical ways, like the Dragoon, Dark Knight, and the Ninja. This severely limited the player's choices when it came to effective and balanced party creations. Final Fantasy V doesn't share these same pitfalls. There are no jobs that can be considered repeats of earlier ones but with higher stats. While not every job serves a unique function, they all fulfill their roles in unique ways. And even those that come dangerously close to being redundant are salvaged by the AP system and the permanent abilities that can be learned from them. It's no secret that Final Fantasy V's job system is its best element. It's fun to have such a large amount of customization available when preparing your party for combat. But what I feel a lot of people don't realize is that the freedom of the job system doesn't just benefit the creative expression of the player. It also benefits the expression of the developers. Final Fantasy IV's brilliance came from the purposefulness of its pacing and linearity. Every encounter was specifically placed and balanced, which the devs could do because they knew exactly what tools the player would have at their disposal at any given time. Final Fantasy V is the exact opposite. Because of the job system, the designers knew that the players had a plethora of tools at their disposal and were able to let their creativity fly, especially when it came to boss design, which allowed for a number of unique and in many cases challenging encounters, at least by Final Fantasy standards. They didn't have to weigh themselves down with questions of how a specific party would be able to defeat each boss, because completely transforming your party for each encounter is always a possibility. This effectively moves the task of game balance from the dev team to the player. Final Fantasy V is one of the only JRPGs I've ever played where a lack of gameplay and difficulty balancing is a well-implemented, intentional choice, as opposed to feeling like a result of bad or rushed design. A lot of coverage of Final Fantasy V stops here, only discussing the job system as it pertains to combat, but it accomplishes so much more than that. It actively changes the way the player is going to experience the game's world. Obvious examples come in the form of the thief's ability to spot secret passages and the geomancer's ability to avoid surprise pitfalls, but it also encourages exploration in a very organic way. The summoner and bard classes have to find most of their abilities in specific locations throughout the world, which means players are more likely to search thoroughly throughout their adventure. Beastmaster and Blue Mage encourage you to seek out all possible monster formations in every area you visit so you can make full use of their unique abilities. Chemist requires specific hard-to-find consumable ingredients that necessitate both exploration and experimentation to make proper use of. Speaking of Chemist, some of these jobs have a bit of inherent synergy to them. After all, if you have a chemist in your party, you'll likely also want someone with the steel command so you can more easily search for and stockpile crafting ingredients. These classes aren't necessarily easy to make use of early on, but if you put in the legwork, they're some of the most powerful classes in the game. And working to unlock their full potential leads naturally into more thorough understanding and appreciation for the game's towns and dungeons. And those dungeons are absolutely worth appreciating. Much like the boss fights, nearly every dungeon has a gimmick that makes them unique and memorable. The fire-powered ship is a maze of air ducts, conveyor belts, and moving platforms. The fork tower forces you to split your party in two, with one side making it impossible to cast magic, while the other only allows for magic. Even one of the game's most basic dungeons, the North Mountain, has you avoiding poisonous plants as you scale it, which adds something more to the experience than simply walking from point A to point B while fending off random encounters. This sort of interactivity always makes locations in RPGs more satisfying and memorable to me, and Final Fantasy V does more with the idea than any other game in the series, either before or after. This variety does come with an arguable downside. All of these locations are a bit disjointed from a world building standpoint, focusing on what is fun rather than worrying about things like cohesion or lore. This gives Final Fantasy V a more artificial feel when compared to its predecessor's world design, but given the game's tongue-in-cheek tone, I don't think that the lack of consideration really takes away from the overall experience. Final Fantasy V's gameplay is pretty phenomenal. If you force me to come up with a complaint about it, the only thing that I can think of is that AP progression is a bit too slow during the mid-game, which makes truly experimenting with the finer details of the class system difficult for a new player. However, as an experienced player, it's more than possible to get completely overpowered setups without ever once having to grind, which gives the game an incredibly smooth pace, but that is with a character progression roadmap pre-planned. Barring some insight into which job ability combinations are useful and which aren't, there's not a lot of wiggle room without going out of your way to farm ability points. The game does provide places for you to do so if you go looking for them, but gambling real-life time for the possibility of an interesting in-game ability isn't exactly my idea of fun. This could have been easily solved by lowering some AP caps or letting enemies distribute AP a bit more liberally over the course of the adventure, but I do admit that this is more of a personal taste thing. I never felt my progression was truly hampered by the AP accrual, but I do wish that playing with the game's most interesting mechanic was a little less time-consuming. I guess if I could suggest one other improvement, it would have been to allow 3 equipable abilities at all times instead of only 2. 1 passive ability slot and 2 active ability slots would have allowed for much more creative character builds, but I'm guessing that Square themselves have already had that realization since the Final Fantasy Tactics games, which use a very similar job system, have long since adopted this change. Final Fantasy V's implementation of its job system makes it an absolute standout in the genre. Even its spiritual successors, Bravely Default and Octopath Traveler, fail to truly grasp and utilize the advantages of Final Fantasy V's best elements. I really can't stress enough how much the gameplay alone makes Final Fantasy V worth experiencing if you somehow haven't already. And I'm going to re-emphasize that. Gameplay alone, because the quality of the story stands in stark contrast to the quality of the mechanics. I know that I tend to have higher standards than most when it comes to storytelling in JRPGs. I'm sure my video on Chrono Triggers made that more than clear. So it likely won't surprise you all to hear that I didn't particularly enjoy Final Fantasy V storytelling, especially since the greater fan base seems to match my opinion for once. The story is dumb, but that doesn't matter because Final Fantasy V is about gameplay. This is a sentiment you'll find spammed through pretty much every message board discussing the game. And while I agree with this consensus, giving the game a pass without dissecting the story wouldn't really fit my MO. There will be spoilers from this point on, so skip to the timestamp if you don't want the game ruined for you. I've stalled as long as I can, so in the words of our inspiring protagonist, yo ho ho and stuff, time to cast off. I hate this game script so much. In my Final Fantasy IV video, I discussed the difference between flat and round characters and their purpose in the story. Not every character in that story was remarkably well developed, but the flat characters did bolster the story by giving the round characters someone to work off of and by fleshing out the world. Final Fantasy V offers no such discussion. Because the characters are so one-dimensional, I'm surprised they even have 2D sprites. The defining attributes aren't so much traits as quirks. Bartz hates heights, Lena loves animals, Galuf has amnesia, and Kryl is Galuf's granddaughter? And that's not fair to Kryl. Her real quirk is that she can talk to animals. This is never explained, but it's used to force the plot forward a couple times when it otherwise would have stalled, so yay for convenient superpowers. Ferris is the only party member with any form of story arc or personality, even if it is a shallow one. She's a woman whom disguises herself as a man for the first couple of hours of the game before being exposed as female. She explains that she first donned the disguise because she grew up on a pirate ship of nothing but men, but it's implied that she's since become more comfortable presenting in a traditionally non-feminine way. Ferris has become a fan favorite, especially in the LGBTQ+ circles because she bucks traditional gender norms. I also feel this makes her more interesting than the rest of the cast, but only marginally so. She stands out from her brethren in the same way cardstock stands out from construction paper. There's a frequently made argument that the characters in games like Final Fantasy V are given less identity because of the customizable gameplay aspect, that they can't be well written because it would clash too much with the game's core design. But I strongly disagree. You can quite easily write characters without specific combat roles, you still have distinct goals and personalities. Square's even done it themselves since. I think the main reason the characters are so one-note is so that they can react predictably to the script's many punchlines. Final Fantasy V is undeniably trying to be a comedy. Because of that, it's easy to write off all of its poor writing decisions as part of the joke. But the fact that the game is a comedy actually hurts it more than benefits it for two main reasons. The first is that the game does have several moments that are meant to be taken seriously, but they're sandwiched between so many jokes that it lessens their impact. And the second is that I just don't find the game funny. The jokes on offer are often simple. Galuf is old. That little girl sure is strong. Uh-oh, these two men are turned on by another man. Oh wait, thank God she's not no homo. For the sake of fairness, I'll admit that even I have a soft spot for Gilgamesh. How could anyone resist this guy? He always gets a chuckle out of me, but little else in the game has that effect. And I'm not trying to pretend as if I'm above the humor here. I'm a grown-ass man that still watches cartoons, and you couldn't spend an hour with my friend group without someone spouting some childish innuendo that would get me to chuckle. But Final Fantasy V's gags almost never landed for me. A big part of humor isn't just what is happening, but who it's happening to. And since the characters in Final Fantasy V are so shallow that I couldn't connect to them, the punchlines didn't connect with me either. As I alluded to before, even the moments the game expects the player to take seriously are surrounded by jokes. At least I think they're supposed to be jokes. It's really hard to tell because Final Fantasy V is so inconsistent. Let's look at an example. While exploring the newly merged world, the party stumbles upon Guido the Sage, and after just enough exposition, Kryl curls over in pain from a splinter of wood stuck in her skin. But wait, it's not just any splinter. It turns out to be X-Death himself. X-Death, the game's main villain, disguised himself as a f***ing splinter. The party is quickly overwhelmed and the wise old sage has no choice but to join the fray. I don't have words. Watching a turtle fight a tree is probably the dumbest thing I've had to talk about in a video since a zombie fought the internet. Oh my god, it's been 4 years since I made my video on Indigo Prophecy. Don't watch it, it's bad. Anyway, for what I imagine to be pretty obvious reasons, I think this part of the game is pretty stupid, and it follows relatively shortly after what was meant to be the traumatic death of an important character. They build up the dread of this enemy and show his immense power, only to have him pathetically butt heads with a turtle sprite on screen. In the Game Boy Advance version, Guido even makes a reference to the Ninja Turtles. This scene is widely infamous for being stupid. There's really no other way to say it. This is the most egregious example of Final Fantasy V's humor getting in the way of its storytelling, but it's not the only example. While running away from the force field that could very well kill the entire party, Gilgamesh appears. Look, I said I enjoyed the character, not necessarily his placement in the story. There's also this scene where Galuf is hanging off the side of a ship and losing his grip, only to crack a joke about it. Am I supposed to feel tense or am I supposed to laugh? Come on, game, make up your mind. I can't be the only one who thinks the massively clashing tones hurt the storytelling, right? I'm not trying to say that the game shouldn't be comedic. I love comedy. That's kind of a redundant statement, isn't it? Who doesn't like comedy? I just think that Final Fantasy V really dropped the ball. At my most generous, I can admit it may just not be for me. If you want examples of Final Fantasy games I feel use their comedic moments much more effectively, look to Final Fantasy VII or Final Fantasy IX. There the humor comes from the characters and the situations as opposed to seemingly random slapstick. But I can look past the humor that just isn't quite to my taste, and I can look past some of the tone issues. The thing I truly despise about Final Fantasy V's storytelling is the scene construction. Once again, the only way I feel I can truly explain myself is to give an example, so I'm going to dissect a scene to show you what I mean. The party has just completed a fetch quest to obtain some medicinal herbs to heal their Windrake. On the party's way up to the castle balcony where the Windrake resides, they check on Kryl, who's bedridden with some sort of illness, so she's left there to rest. The party attempts to feed their Windrake some dragon grass, as it's known to have healing properties, but the Drake refuses. Lena idiotically eats it in front of the Drake to show it's safe to eat while being told outright that it's poisonous to humans. She holds strong long enough for the Drake to eat the plant before collapsing. Kryl rushes outside despite her illness and despite having no way of knowing what is happening on the balcony. With a magic potion she pulls right out of her ass to heal Lena. This results in Lena's immediate recovery, making her sacrifice completely and utterly pointless. Then, just to truly rub salt in the wound, Lena does this dumb-ass fourth wall-breaking, pandering wave to the player, as if acknowledging the fact that this entire entire scene was a waste of time before the game continues like nothing ever happened. All three of these characters are injured solely for this scene, and the fact that they are immediately healed takes all of the potential danger away in mere seconds, making the scene completely pointless in the moment it's taking place. In a grander sense, the scene also doesn't benefit the overall narrative. It's not showing us something about the characters we didn't already know. It's not being used as either setup or payoff for other story events. It's not a reflection of the story's overarching themes. It's not even comedic. Well, not intentionally comedic anyway, so it can't be seen as a way of breaking up previous tension either. Every single beat in this scene is a waste of exposition and time. And I know I'm beginning to sound like a broken record here, but Final Fantasy V doesn't just contain one scene like this. You can spot this pattern repeatedly throughout the course of the story. In fact, this exact set of narrative beats is a repeat of a previous scene in the game where Lena sacrifices her own health to retrieve the same healing plant for a different Windrake, only to be immediately healed by the Drake's magical healing tears. In another scene, Ferris falls off a cliff, immediately climbs back up, and creates a rope bridge for the rest of the party to cross while the enemy stands idly by. In another scene, the entire party is mesmerized by a siren, with the exception of Galuf, who remains unaffected because of his amnesia, meaning he can immediately wake everyone back up while, once again, the boss stands by and waits for it to happen. The team falls down a hole into a mysterious underground laboratory. Galuf is separated from the group, and they reconvene mere seconds later. The team nearly drowns, only to be rescued by Sildra, whom the team assumes was already dead, and then Sildra dies for real. Every single one of these examples follow an identical pattern. Perceived major problem, immediate and anticlimactic solution. There's not enough time between story beats to actually build any drama, just instant solutions to superfluous conflicts. This is one of my biggest pet peeves when it comes to writing: major plot conveniences and completely artificial stakes. These show up so often in Final Fantasy V that it became something I couldn't reasonably ignore. Many fans feel that Final Fantasy IV's many fake-out deaths were annoying in a very similar way, and even I pointed them out as being an issue in my video on the game. But at least there, the story kept you in the dark for more than 30 seconds, and the removal of party members served a purpose to the plot and gameplay by changing out who was in your party at any given time. In Final Fantasy V, the scene served zero purpose. I constantly found myself wondering, what would have been lost if this scene weren't here? What would have been lost by cutting this brief moment of separation between Galuf and the party? How would the story suffer if we didn't see Lena sacrifice her health for a Drake twice? It feels like an improv troupe trying to write a drama. Like the only thought the writers had at any given moment was, what can I say this very second to make the audience gasp before returning to the status quo? As I mentioned earlier, fan discourse leads me to believe that it's not all that contentious of an opinion to say that Final Fantasy V's storytelling isn't very engaging. Ultimately, I, like seemingly most fans, just choose to ignore it and enjoy the game for its superb gameplay mechanics. But the story is still prevalent enough that despite how hard I tried, I couldn't completely ignore it. This, in my opinion, lowered the quality of the title as a piece of art. And I mean this with all sincerity. I would have preferred a nearly non-existent story akin to the first Final Fantasy over what Final Fantasy V spoon-fed me. Hell, I'd even take Mystic Quest over this. It got more laughs out of me than this did, and it didn't pretend to be hiding a good story underneath. I feel bad for being so hard on the game's writing. Maybe in the right mood I could enjoy it ironically in a so bad is good way, but I could never bring myself to call it even remotely well crafted with any sincerity. I guess I need to reiterate that it's okay if you disagree with me here. Hell, Square does. In fact, they loved it so much that they decided to give it an anime sequel. Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals is a 4-part OVA that was released in Japan in 1994. It surprisingly got an official English release on VHS in 1998, presumably to coincide with the explosion of hype the series saw thanks to the marketing for Final Fantasy VII. It's not good. Even if you had somehow played Final Fantasy V, despite its lack of an official release, it would still be nearly impossible to tell that this anime is supposed to be a sequel to it, since it stars none of the same main characters, has a completely different villain, and a different plot. There's very little rhyme or reason to it. It exists entirely as a stage for a bunch of unfunny jokes. 坊やの生きの良さに免じて絶対無敵最悪最強の拷問を受けるがいい。 You know, on second thought, that may make it a more faithful sequel than I'd originally given it credit for. While it may not seem it, I can assure you that it is technically a sequel to Final Fantasy V. The main character is the great-granddaughter of Bartz. And look, there's Mid, and you get a few seconds of actually seeing the original cast at the very end of the anime. See, it's Varys, Lena, Kryl, Bartz, and Gal. Holy Galuf is ripped! This will not be getting a full review from me, but if you wanted my brief opinion, don't watch it. There's a reason not even Square has deemed it worthy of a re-release since its original VHS production, but I felt the need to bring it up because of its historical importance as the first ever direct sequel in the Final Fantasy canon. And from this, we can deduce that Square has never been good at making follow-ups to Final Fantasy games. If gameplay is your primary point of enjoyment when it comes to RPGs, you could easily argue that Final Fantasy V is the best game in the series. It isn't my favorite gameplay system to be featured in a mainline entry, but I do have to admit that in terms of execution, it is absolutely the strongest the series has ever been. This puts me in a bit of a tough position when it comes to critiquing the game fairly. I lean towards gameplay being more important than story in most cases, but I still feel that truly fantastic RPGs can succeed at both gameplay and storytelling. Unfortunately, Final Fantasy V simply doesn't. Having to ignore a large aspect of a game to properly enjoy it is not a defense of the game, especially when attempting to critique it as a piece of art. Since the three key pillars of RPG design to me are combat, exploration, and story, I have to take all three into consideration when making a critique. And with that in mind, I have to, by default, admit that as a whole, Final Fantasy V is not as well crafted as its predecessor. But that only really matters in the more academic, striving for objectivity kind of critique. On a more subjective and anecdotal note, I can say that despite my love for the first 4 Final Fantasy titles, having to play them over and over again for these videos did make me suffer burnout by the time I was finally done with each one. But I'd be more than happy to start another playthrough of Final Fantasy V right now if I had the time. Usually, character build customization isn't enough on its own to make me want to replay a game. But Final Fantasy V has such a depth of customization, such compelling dungeons, and such unique boss encounters that it somehow manages to feel fresh each time I play it. I believe discovery is the most important thing a game needs to be good and memorable, and Final Fantasy V holds it up as its defining characteristic. I played Final Fantasy V all the way through 5 times just for this video, and I've completed it at least 3 times prior to these runs. I still feel like I'm learning new things about it. New combinations of powers, new boss strategies, finding new secret items and hidden chests. I've never felt any sense of discovery from the story or presentation, but the sense of discovery I feel while experimenting with the game's mechanics remains nearly unmatched, not just in the series, but in the genre as a whole. So, what are you waiting for? Go get a job! Thank you all so much for watching. I wanted to give a special shout out to Chris Kohler, the author of the Boss Fights book on Final Fantasy V. That's where I got a lot of the information I used in the history section of this video. I found it really difficult to find information outside of that source in English, so it really helped make up the backbone of that section. I'd also like to personally thank those of you who have supported me on Patreon. We have Caffeine, Gabe Nunez, Giant Wang Jared, Green Pool Ball, M.A., also known as Nicole Hypa. If I pronounce anyone's name wrong, please feel free to let me know in the comments. Thank you all for your support and helping to keep this going. If the rest of you would like to help as well, you can always donate to my Patreon, or if you want to help for free, you can always like, comment, share this video, and subscribe. Hope to see you all again soon. Take care.